Tonight's tale is not about a haunted house. It's about what happens when the walls remember and when silence refuses to forget. Dr. Julia Hale moved to a quiet town, seeking peace after loss. But what she found was a whisper in the attic, a child's locket buried in the wall, and a name lost to time. Abigail Moore. Some spirits scream. Others wait. This is the story of a girl left behind and the woman who finally heard her cry. So turn off the lights, draw the curtains, and listen closely, because the Restless Spirit has something to say. Part 1. Echoes in the Attic. Merrill Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, or thought they did. Tucked between hills thick with pine and mist, its streets curved like veins around the heart of its past. Old homes, forgotten cemeteries, and whispers that never quite stopped echoing. Dr. Julia Hale didn't believe in ghosts, at least not the kind that knocked over picture frames or cried in the attic. She believed in the other kind, the ones that followed people. The kind you couldn't see but always felt, heavy on your shoulders and louder in silence. The kind of ghost that might wear your father's voice or a scream you never got to finish. Julia had moved to Merrill Creek for peace. After the breakdown of her marriage and the death of her younger brother, a car crash that stole both his life and her faith in anything resembling justice, she needed distance. She chose Merrill Creek because it was quiet, slow, and out of the way. She didn't expect the attic to whisper. It started with footsteps, not heavy ones. Just the soft creaking shift of old wood when something or someone moved above her bedroom late at night. Her cottage was old, yes, but not that old. She'd had it inspected. No raccoons, no squirrels. The first time she heard it, she froze in bed. Her hand went instinctively to her phone. Then she reasoned it away. Wind, maybe the old house settling. She even smiled bitterly to herself. The ghosts are just metaphors, Jules, she whispered, not tenants. But the next night it returned, and this time the sound was followed by something else. A whisper, just above her ceiling, barely audible, like someone mouthing words through a wall. Help? At Merrill Creek High School, Ethan Walker kept to himself. He was tall for 17 with dark eyes that looked older than he was. The other kids left him alone, not out of meanness, out of fear. Everyone knew what had happened 2 years ago. His parents, both of them, dead in a fire that left no answers. Ethan had been in the house. He walked out without a burn. The fire marshal called it a miracle. The town called it something else. He'd moved in with his aunt, who rarely spoke and never smiled. He worked at the gas station after school and walked home, even in the rain. And lately, he hadn't been sleeping. Because Ethan heard the voice too. Not in his attic, but in the mirror. Not always words, but sounds. Sobs, gasps, and once, laughter. Childish, mocking. He started seeing things. Faces and reflections, smudges on windows that looked like handprints, a girl in white at the edge of the woods. He didn't tell anyone, not his aunt, not the school counselor, certainly not the sheriff, who still looked at him like he might have started that fire himself. But last night, it changed. He found something under his bed, a small, scorched locket, and inside it, a photograph of a girl. Sheriff Tom Briggs had seen just about every kind of tragedy Merrill Creek could offer. Drunk driving accidents, meth labs, suicides in barns. But the strangest things always happened around that house, the one Dr. Hale had just bought. He didn't believe in ghosts, not officially, but he remembered being a boy and watching his dog refuse to enter the property line of that old Carter house. And he remembered the stories the old-timers told. About the girl, Abigail Moore, disappeared in 1957, never found, believed to have been last seen near the Carter home. The Carters were wealthy and connected back then. No one dug too deep. No one asked why a family with so much land kept locking one attic window from the outside. Now the house belonged to a doctor from out of town, and Tom Briggs had just gotten a call from her. She'd heard something in the attic. He sighed, pulling on his jacket. The sky above Merrill Creek was darkening again, storm coming. Dr. Julia Hale opened the attic door slowly. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Maybe some old insulation or a dead squirrel. What she didn't expect was the cold. It hit her like a breath held too long. Sudden, sharp, unnatural. Her flashlight flickered. The beam landed on boxes, old trunks, dusty furniture covered in sheets. Everything looked ordinary until she saw the footprints, small, bare, leading across the dust-covered floorboards. She followed them, heart hammering. They stopped in front of a wall. Not a window, not a door, just a wall. Except, now that she looked closer, it wasn't just a wall, there was a seam. She dropped to her knees, brushing the dust away. Her fingers found a gap, an old hidden panel. Trembling, she pulled it open. Behind it, there was a space, a crawl space, and inside it, a child's shoe. Next to it, bones, small, fragile, and clutched in the tiny hand, a locket. Part 2, The Locket's Secret. Dr. Julia Hale sat on the porch, wrapped in a thick sweater. The locket clutched in her hand like it might vanish. The bones were real. Sheriff Briggs confirmed it after combing through the attic crawl space with tight lips and a pale face. The remains were sent off for testing, but they both knew whose they were. Abigail Moore. Julia couldn't stop staring at the locket. It was tarnished but intact. The oval case was engraved with delicate flowers. One side burned slightly, the hinge still working. Inside was a faded photo of a young girl, no older than 10, with a soft smile and ribboned hair. She looked so innocent, but when Julia closed the locket, her hand trembled because last night she had dreamed of the girl. Not how she looked in the photo, but how she might have looked after 50 years of being lost in the dark. Ethan Walker stared at the same locket, identical, except his wasn't dug out of an attic wall. His had simply appeared. He had tried throwing it away, twice. It kept coming back, once in his school locker. Another time it showed up on his pillow. He couldn't explain it, couldn't understand it. And worse, he had started hearing her, whispers, at first, then sobs, then actual words. He locked me in. She didn't help. I was just a child. The voice was feminine, young, soaked in sadness and something else, rage. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He found himself walking past the church, past the old trail toward the Carter house. Dr. Hale's place now. He didn't plan on knocking. He planned on standing across the street and staring until the house blinked. But as he reached the corner, the front door opened. Julia stepped out, the locket dangling from her fingers. They stared at each other, and in that moment, both realized they held the same locket. Sheriff Briggs watched the scene unfold from his cruiser, parked discreetly beneath a maple tree. When Julia had called earlier that day, "Sheriff, it's not just bones. There's something here, something wrong." He'd chalked it up to shock, trauma. The human mind could fill in all kinds of gaps when grief set in. But then the ME called. The bones were over 60 years old. They belonged to a girl between 9 and 11. And the marks on the ribs, the skull, they weren't from an accident. Someone had locked her in and left her to die. Now Julia was standing outside with the Walker boy, and even from a distance, Tom could tell they weren't just talking about coincidences. They were unraveling something. And the house, he swore the damn house, felt like it was watching them. Inside the house, they sat at the kitchen table, the two identical lockets laid side by side. "It's hers," Julia said, voice quiet. "The girl in my attic, Abigail Moore." Ethan nodded slowly. "She talks to me, in dreams, sometimes through mirrors." Julia leaned in. "What does she say?" She's angry, he paused, and she keeps asking for Lillian. Julia blinked. Lillian? Yeah, said she watched, said she left her there. Julia stood up, pacing. Lillian Carter owned this house. The Carter family adopted Abigail. It was all over the town archives, but nobody ever asked why she vanished. Just silence. Ethan frowned. If Abigail's haunting us, is it revenge? Julia turned toward the hallway. The attic door creaked open on its own. No, she whispered. It's not revenge. She's still trapped. That night, Julia and Ethan stood at the attic entrance, flashlights in hand. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked. No, Ethan replied, but she won't stop until we listen. They climbed the stairs. The temperature dropped with each step. In the attic, the crawl space was still open. They stepped inside, together. Inside, they found more than bones. They found drawings, scratched onto the wood, little stick figures, a girl, a tall man, a woman with no face, crude, frantic messages, no light. Lillian went away. I'm still here. Suddenly, the air shifted. The flashlight flickered, and from the wall, a voice, not a whisper, not a hallucination, a child's voice, clear and desperate. He said she was mine. She said I was no one. Why did she lock the door? Why did she leave me? Julia stepped closer. Abigail, we're here. We found you. We're not going to leave you again. The shadows pulsed. Ethan knelt beside the drawing. He touched the name Lillian, scratched violently into the wood. And as he did, the wall shuddered, then cracked. Behind the panel, a staircase, old, crumbling, leading downward. Julia looked at Ethan. She wasn't just buried in the attic, she was buried beneath the house. Part 3. Beneath the Floorboards. The staircase groaned under their feet as Julia and Ethan descended into the unknown space beneath the attic. The air thickened, colder than any natural basement should be. It didn't smell like mold or dust. It smelled of old sorrow, like something grieving in the dark for decades. The beam from Julia's flashlight trembled as she stepped off the last stair. She had expected a root cellar, maybe a wine storage vault. What she found was something else entirely. It was a room, a secret one. The walls were stone, carved crudely as if by hand. Chains hung from the far corner, rusted through, the shackles small enough for a child. In the center of the room sat a child's chair, painted white but stained dark, and on the far wall something written in old charcoal. I was not a mistake. Ethan's voice shook. She was kept here. Julia nodded slowly, scanning the room. This wasn't an accident. This was a prison. Ethan turned. Why would someone do this? Before Julia could answer, her flashlight flickered, then died. Total blackness, and in the silence, the sound of chains rattling. Sheriff Tom Briggs parked outside Julia's home, a creeping unease tugging at his chest. He hadn't heard back from her since the call earlier that day, and something gnawed at him. Some part of himself he'd spent decades learning to ignore. He stepped inside the house, calling out. No answer. Then he heard it. Footsteps above, then below. His gut twisted. He followed the sounds to the attic, climbed cautiously, and found the hidden crawl space. A light wind whispered from the open panel, like breath exhaled from a grave. He followed it, down, into the dark. When the flashlight came back on, it was dim, but enough. Julia and Ethan stood side by side, staring into the shadowed corners of the hidden chamber. And then she appeared, the girl, Abigail. She was not monstrous, not demonic. She was pale, eyes too wide, hair tangled and long. She wore the same dress from the photograph in the locket, only now it was torn and burnt at the hem. She didn't speak. She just pointed to the wall. Julia stepped forward, brushing away soot and dust. Beneath the grime was a door, wooden, hidden behind a false stone slab. She pulled, it creaked open. Inside was another room, smaller, claustrophobic, a child's bed, torn blankets, broken toys, and a single journal wrapped in twine. Julia picked it up. The name carved into the cover, Lillian Carter. The journal was filled with neat cursive. Abigail screams again. I told her to stop. It's not right the way she looks at me, like she's my daughter. She's not. She was never supposed to be mine. They said it would bring peace. The medium said the girl's spirit would quiet the voices. But the house is louder now. I see her in mirrors. She's angry. I told Thomas to lock her in. It was for her own good. She won't forgive me, and I don't blame her. If anyone finds this, I'm sorry. I couldn't fix what I did. Julia closed the book, hands trembling. She was adopted, but Lillian didn't want her. She used her. Ethan stared at Abigail. Used her for what? Spiritual protection, Julia said, her voice cracking. Lillian was obsessed with the occult. She believed sacrificing a child would protect the family from a curse. Did it? No, Julia looked up. It cursed the entire town. Sheriff Briggs stepped into the room just as the final sentence left Julia's lips. He took one look at Abigail and paled. My God, you knew her, didn't you? Julia asked softly. Tom nodded slowly. I was a boy. I used to play in the yard with her. Then one day she was gone. My daddy told me never to speak her name, said she ran away. She didn't, Ethan whispered. No. The sheriff looked at the ghost. She was murdered. Abigail turned toward him, and for the first time she spoke. You saw me. You could have helped. Briggs swallowed hard. Tears formed in his eyes. I was afraid. I didn't know what they'd done. I was just a kid. You left me, she whispered. The lights began to flicker again. Chains lifted on their own. The shadows coiled. She's angry, Ethan said. She doesn't know peace. She doesn't know the truth, Julia corrected. She doesn't know she was loved. They left the basement together. Ethan carried the journal. Sheriff Briggs carried Abigail's locket. Julia carried the weight of it all. That night, they held a vigil. At the old graveyard behind the town chapel, they lit candles and placed the remains in a new grave, a proper one, with a stone that bore her full name, Abigail Rose Moore, 1947, you were never forgotten. And as the final words were spoken, a breeze swept through the trees, a soft sigh on the wind, and the flickering candle steadied. For the first time, Julia felt warmth in the air. Abigail was no longer restless, but something else was. Part 4, The Unfinished Curse. The night after Abigail's funeral, the town of Merrill Creek slept easier than it had in decades. No footsteps in the attic, no whispers in mirrors, no glowing eyes in the shadows. Julia Hale thought it was over. So did Ethan. But the next morning when Julia awoke, her window was wide open, despite having locked it, and there were 3 words scrawled in ash on her bathroom mirror, not just her. She stared for a long time, frozen, the toothbrush slipping from her hand. Her heart thudded. She wanted to believe it was a coincidence, a smudge, a trick. But deep down, she knew. The curse that haunted Abigail had not ended. It had only shifted. Ethan walked through the woods behind his aunt's house, following a dream he couldn't shake. In it, he stood in the forest, alone, the air heavy, and in the dream, the ground cracked, revealing dozens of faces beneath the soil. Children, women, men, all whispering the same name, Carter, he had told Julia. Together, they combed the town's archives. Lillian Carter's history was darker than anyone had recorded. She wasn't just a reclusive widow with occult interests. She was the last of a family that dabbled in ritual sacrifices dating back to the 1800s, a practice hidden behind philanthropy and charm. And every 40 years, someone vanished. Always a child. Abigail was just one of many. Sheriff Briggs found the first new clue. The town's church had burned in 1967, long after Abigail's death. But beneath the rebuilt structure was a sealed room, once a crypt, forgotten. He had gone there on a hunch after dreaming of bells and smoke. The crypt's lock was old, but his keyring, once used by the sheriff before him, had a match. Inside, he found remnants, wax symbols, animal bones, a faded portrait of Jonathan Carter, Lillian's grandfather, and a map, one marked with symbols of sacrifice and circled dates. The last marked date, 2025, this year. The final entry read, "The seventh offering shall complete the pact, then the house shall sleep." Julia, Ethan, and Briggs met in the town library, candles lit during a storm that cut the power. "We thought Abigail was the curse," Julia said, "but she was a victim, a warning." Briggs laid out the map. The Carters made a deal. Generational protection in exchange for offerings. It wasn't superstition, it was a pact. Ethan pointed at the final date. "If that's true and 2025 is the final offering, we still have time," Julia said, "to stop it, to break it." "But how?" Briggs asked. Julia stared down at Abigail's journal. One line stood out in fresh ink. They hadn't written it. "The final offering must choose." The three of them searched the town records again. Disappearances, mysterious deaths, and they found them. 6 others, all spaced exactly 40 years apart. 1805, William Carter, age 7. 1845, Margaret Keller, age 9. 1885, Nathan Green, age 8. 1925, Caroline Briggs, age 10. 1965, Daniel West, age 6 to 5. Abigail Moore, age 10. And now 2025. They all had one thing in common. All were orphans. Julia's breath caught in her throat. "So is Ethan," she whispered. Ethan froze. "No," he said. "No, that can't be what this is about." Julia stepped back. "That's why you've been seeing her. Why you found the locket. She wore the 7th. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened. The candles guttered. A cold wind swept through the building, and every book on the table flew open. One page in the oldest grimoire fluttered violently, stopping on a single spell. "To end the binding, the chosen must return, not in blood but by light." Julia read it aloud. "What does it mean?" Ethan looked toward the storm outside. "It means," he said, voice hard, "I have to go back to the house." "To do what?" Briggs asked. "To confront them, the ones who made the deal, the ones still in the dark." That night, Ethan entered the Carter house alone. Julia waited outside, standing in the cold rain, hands clenched. Sheriff Briggs stood beside her, his pistol holstered but shaking. Inside, the house creaked. The walls wept moisture, and the lights all off. Ethan lit a single candle, walked slowly toward the attic. As he climbed the steps, he felt the pressure. Heavy, suffocating. At the top, the attic door opened on its own. He stepped in. They were waiting. Not just Abigail, but all of them, the other 6. Children, pale, translucent, eyes wide and silent. Behind them a shape, vast, shadowy, wearing the Carter name like a crown. "You were chosen," it hissed. Ethan didn't flinch. "I choose something else." He held up the candle. "Light," he said, "not blood." The candle ignited, bright as a flare. The shadows screamed. The children vanished. The house shook violently, and the shape exploded into smoke. Outside, Julia and Briggs staggered back as the house groaned, shuddered, then stilled. A second later, the door opened. Ethan walked out, soaked, pale, but alive. Part 5. The Final Light. The morning after the storm, Merrill Creek was different. The air felt lighter, softer, and for the first time in years, the old Carter house stood silent. Not watching, not whispering, just still. Julia Hale stood on her porch, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. Across the street, Ethan Walker sat beneath a tree, staring at the sunrise as if trying to remember what peace felt like. He had come back from the attic alive, but not unchanged. Ethan hadn't spoken much since the night of the confrontation. The house had gone quiet the moment the candle flared, every window bursting open in a violent exhale, every door slamming shut behind him. And then, silence. In that moment, the curse broke. He had stood before the spirit of the pact, whatever had worn the Carter name like a cloak, and rejected it. Not with violence, not with blood, but with something it could never understand. Choice. The 7th child had broken the chain, and in doing so, freed the others. Sheriff Briggs submitted his retirement 2 days later. He never told the full story in his report. He couldn't. How do you explain 7 spirits vanishing in a flash of light? How do you explain that you were once a child who saw a girl in a window and said nothing? Instead, he visited Abigail's new grave every Sunday, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with apologies, always with the quiet dignity of a man who finally faced his own ghosts. Julia reopened her practice that week, but she wasn't the same therapist she was before. She began specializing in grief cases, not just the kind where loved ones were lost, but the kind where people were haunted by memories, by guilt, by what-ifs. She kept Abigail's locket on her desk, not as a warning, but as a promise that even the most restless spirit can find peace. Ethan started writing, a journal at first, then a blog, then a book. It was called The House That Chose Light. He never named the town, never named the family, but readers knew, because every small town has its shadows, every attic has echoes, and sometimes the scariest thing isn't the ghost, it's the silence that comes after. 1 year later, on the anniversary of Abigail's funeral, the town gathered at the chapel. Julia spoke briefly, so did Ethan, and for the first time the name Abigail Moore was spoken aloud by the people of Merrill Creek, no longer hidden, no longer feared, no longer forgotten. The sky was clear, candles lit the field, and as Ethan placed a final white rose on the grave, he whispered, "You were the first to fight. I was just the last." As they turned to leave, Julia looked back at the old Carter house one last time. In the attic window, for just a second, a faint silhouette stood. A girl in white, smiling, and then gone. The wind was warm, the curse was over, the spirit was finally at peace. And so, the house grew quiet, not because the spirit was gone, but because she was finally heard. Abigail Moore was more than a ghost. She was a memory, buried, broken, and waiting to be remembered. And when truth met courage, the past let go. Julia Hale came looking for peace. Instead, she gave it to a little girl who had waited in the dark for 60 years. Tonight, the attic is silent, the whispers have stopped, and the restless spirit has finally found rest. Thank you for listening to Ghost Path Legends. Until next time, keep your light on and listen, just in case someone's still waiting to be heard.